You've been told your whole life that avoiding women makes you weak. But what if the opposite is true? What if the strongest men in history understood something about power that modern society desperately wants you to forget? Machiavelli knew that princes who prioritized romantic relationships over personal sovereignty inevitably lost their kingdoms. And today's most successful men are quietly applying this ancient wisdom while their peers chase validation and compromise. Their potential for temporary pleasures. This isn't about hatred or fear. This is about recognizing that your power is your most valuable asset, and some prices are simply too high to pay, even for love. Every powerful man faces the same fundamental choice that plagued princes throughout history: surrender his autonomy for companionship or maintain his sovereignty at the cost of isolation. Machiavelli understood that true power requires absolute control over your decisions, your time, and your emotional state. When you enter the realm of romantic relationships, you inevitably hand over pieces of this control to another person. The modern man who chooses solitude isn't running from women. He's running towards something far more valuable. He recognizes that his greatest strength lies not in his ability to attract, but in his capacity to remain uncompromised. The prince who ruled kingdoms knew that every alliance came with strings attached. Every emotional bond created potential, leverage for enemies to exploit. Today's successful men understand this ancient wisdom on a visceral level. They see how their peers become shadows of themselves, changing their goals, their habits, even their personalities to maintain relationships. These strategic men choose deliberate isolation because they've witnessed the slow erosion of masculine power that occurs when emotional dependency takes root. They prefer the clean pain of loneliness to the complex suffering of compromised decision-making. This isn't about hatred or fear of women. This is about understanding the mathematical reality of power dynamics. Machiavelli taught that it's better to be feared than loved because fear is reliable while love is fickle. The man who avoids romantic entanglements applies this principle to his personal life. He chooses the reliability of self-sufficiency over the unpredictable nature of emotional relationships. His solitude becomes his fortress, his independence becomes his weapon, and his refusal to compromise becomes his greatest source of strength in a world that constantly demands he surrender pieces of himself. Machiavelli viewed power as the ultimate currency. Once spent, it's nearly impossible to recover. Modern men who understand this principle treat their autonomy like a finite resource that must be protected at all costs. When you enter relationships, you begin making trades. Your time for her attention, your goals for shared compromises, your freedom for her approval. Each trade diminishes your total power reserves. The wise man recognizes that temporary pleasures and fleeting emotions are poor investments when measured against long-term sovereignty. Consider how successful men operate in business. They never make deals that leave them weaker than before. Yet in relationships, these same strategic thinkers abandon all logic and make emotional bargains that slowly drain their influence. They trade their gym time for movie nights, their ambitious projects for relationship maintenance, their individual identity for couple identity. Machiavelli would call this the behavior of weak princes who prioritize immediate gratification over lasting dominance. The powerful man sees through this trap. Power compounds when preserved and fragments when distributed. Every commitment you make to another person creates an obligation that limits your future choices. The man who chooses strategic solitude isn't missing out. He's accumulating power while others are spending theirs. He watches his peers become negotiators in their own lives, constantly seeking permission and approval for decisions they once made independently. His refusal to enter this marketplace keeps his currency intact and his options unlimited. Machiavelli taught that sometimes the most powerful move is the one you don't make. Strategic withdrawal isn't retreat, it's calculated positioning that preserves your strength while others exhaust theirs in meaningless battles. The man who avoids romantic entanglements practices this ancient military wisdom in modern life, while other men chase validation through dating apps and spend their energy pursuing women. He conserves his resources for conquests that actually matter. His absence from the game becomes his greatest advantage because scarcity creates value. Every general knows that choosing your battles determines whether you win the war. The strategic man applies this principle to relationships by simply refusing to participate in dynamics that don't serve his larger objectives. He watches other men become reactive, changing their entire lives based on female approval or disapproval. Meanwhile, his withdrawal forces the world to come to him on his terms. Women become curious about the man who doesn't chase. Opportunities arise from his reputation as someone who can't be easily obtained or manipulated. This calculated distance creates a psychological effect that pursuit never could. Machiavelli understood that mystery generates more influence than familiarity ever will. The man who remains slightly out of reach maintains his power to choose rather than becoming chosen. His strategic withdrawal becomes a form of psychological warfare where his very absence communicates strength. Others interpret his solitude as confidence rather than fear, creating the exact perception of power that opens doors without him having to knock. Machiavelli believed that a prince who cannot govern his own emotions has no business governing others. The man who chooses solitude to protect his power understands that emotional independence is the foundation of all other forms of strength. When you need validation, affection, or approval from women, you hand them the keys to your emotional kingdom. They can raise your mood with a smile or destroy your day with indifference. This emotional dependency turns grown men into children, seeking parental approval from romantic partners. True sovereignty means your happiness, confidence, and sense of worth come from within rather than external sources. The strategic man builds his emotional fortress so strong that nothing from the outside can shake its foundations. He finds fulfillment in his work, his goals, his physical strength, and his personal growth. This self-sufficiency creates an unshakable core that can't be manipulated or leveraged against him. While other men's moods fluctuate based on their relationship status, he remains constant and reliable. This emotional independence becomes magnetic precisely because it's so rare in modern men. Women encounter countless men whose entire sense of self depends on female approval. They rarely meet someone whose happiness is completely self-generated. The emotionally sovereign man stands out like a lighthouse in a storm of needy masculine energy. His emotional stability becomes his greatest asset because others naturally gravitate toward those who seem unaffected by the chaos that overwhelms everyone else. Lost their kingdoms. Modern romance creates the same destructive illusion. It convinces men that emotional surrender equals strength when it actually signals the beginning of their downfall. Love makes men believe that vulnerability is masculine, when history proves that exposed leaders become conquered leaders. The man who falls in love hands over his logical decision-making to chemical reactions and emotional impulses that serve biological programming rather than his strategic interests. Romance transforms rational men into emotional slaves who justify their weakness as devotion. They begin making decisions based on feelings rather than facts, prioritizing their partner's happiness over their own advancement. Machiavelli understood that effective leaders must remain coldly analytical about human nature, including their own. The moment you start believing someone loves you unconditionally, you stop preparing for the inevitable moment when conditions change. Love blinds men to red flags, makes them ignore obvious manipulation, and convinces them to trust people whose loyalty hasn't been tested by adversity. The illusion becomes complete when men start believing that romantic partnership enhances their masculine authority instead of undermining it. They convince themselves that having a woman validates their worth when the opposite is true. Real masculine authority comes from self-reliance, not from someone else's approval or affection. The strategic man sees through this cultural programming and chooses the harsh clarity of solitude over the comforting delusions of romance. The prince taught that dependency is the fastest path to destruction because it gives others the power to control your fate. Machiavelli observed how rulers who relied on foreign armies, popular approval, or economic partnerships inevitably found themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. The modern man, who creates emotional or physical dependencies on women, faces the same strategic weakness. When you need someone for happiness, companionship, or validation, you've essentially handed them a weapon that can be used against you at any moment. Dependencies create predictable patterns that enemies can exploit. The woman who knows you can't function without her affection holds more power over you than any business rival or competitor ever could. She can withdraw her attention to punish you, threaten to leave to control your behavior, or simply become indifferent to devastate your emotional state. Machiavelli would recognize these tactics immediately. They're the same methods used to control weak princes throughout history. The dependent man becomes a puppet dancing to someone else's emotional strings. Independence, however, creates the opposite dynamic, where others become dependent on your approval, rather than you seeking theirs. When you genuinely don't need romantic validation, women must compete for your attention instead of you competing for theirs. This reversal of dependency shifts the entire power structure in your favor. Your self-sufficiency becomes your greatest strength because it cannot be taken away, manipulated, or used as leverage against your interests and long-term goals. Every strategic man faces Machiavelli's ultimate paradox. The path to true power often leads through the valley of isolation. The modern prince who chooses solitude to preserve his sovereignty must navigate the psychological weight of loneliness while society constantly tells him he's missing out. This isn't the comfortable solitude of monks or hermits. This is the deliberate choice to endure emotional discomfort in service of a larger, strategic vision. The weak man avoids this discomfort by seeking constant companionship, but the strong man embraces it as the price of freedom. Loneliness becomes a test of your commitment to your own power. When Friday night arrives and your peers are out with their partners, you're alone with your thoughts, your goals, and the uncomfortable silence that reveals who you really are. This solitude strips away all external validation and forces you to confront whether your sense of self can survive without constant reinforcement from others. Most men fail this test and rush back into relationships that weaken them rather than face the mirror of isolation, but liberation lives on the other side of this loneliness. The man who can thrive in solitude discovers capabilities he never knew he possessed. His creativity explodes without the need to constantly consider someone else's opinions. His goals become laser-focused without competing priorities pulling his attention in different directions. His confidence grows from internal sources rather than external validation. The paradox resolves itself. Temporary loneliness creates permanent liberation from the need for others' approval. Machiavelli distinguished between alliances that served strategic purposes and emotional attachments that compromised judgment. The intelligent man applies this Same discernment to modern relationships by understanding the difference between connections that advance his interests and entanglements that drain his power. Strategic relationships operate on clear terms with defined boundaries. Both parties benefit without creating dependencies that weaken either side. Emotional entanglements, however, blur these boundaries and create obligations that serve feelings rather than strategic objectives. A strategic relationship with a woman might involve mutual respect, shared activities, and physical connection, without the emotional baggage that turns grown men into approval-seeking children. Both parties maintain their independence, pursue their individual goals, and interact from positions of strength rather than need. There's no drama, no manipulation, no power struggles because neither person is trying to control or change the other. This approach requires emotional maturity that most people lack because they've been conditioned to believe that intensity equals intimacy. Emotional entanglements, by contrast, create messy webs of obligations, expectations, and dependencies that serve no one's strategic interests. They generate drama, consume mental energy, and force constant negotiations over boundaries that should remain fixed. The strategic man recognizes these patterns early and either restructures the dynamic or withdraws completely. He understands that relationships should enhance his life rather than complicate it, support his goals rather than compete with them, and strengthen his position rather than create vulnerabilities that others can exploit. Machiavelli understood that true princes think in decades, while pretenders think in moments. The man who avoids romantic entanglements to protect his power operates with this same long-term vision, while his peers chase immediate emotional gratification. While other men spend their 20s and 30s managing relationship drama, seeking approval and compromising their goals for romantic partnerships, the strategic man builds his empire in silence. He invests the time others waste on dating apps into developing skills, the energy others burn on relationship maintenance into advancing his career, and the mental space others fill with romantic anxiety into strategic planning. This long game mentality requires extraordinary discipline because the rewards aren't immediately visible. Society celebrates the man with the beautiful girlfriend while ignoring the man who's systematically building wealth, developing expertise, and expanding his influence. The strategic man endures years of being misunderstood, labeled as antisocial, or pitied for his apparent loneliness. Meanwhile, he's constructing the foundation of real power that will serve him for decades, rather than chasing the temporary high of romantic validation that fades within months. The compounding effect of this approach becomes undeniable over time. While his peers enter their 40s, dealing with divorces, custody battles, and financial obligations created by romantic decisions, the strategic man enters his prime years with accumulated wealth, refined skills, and complete freedom to pursue opportunities. His empire stands strong because it was built on the solid foundation of self-reliance rather than the shifting sands of emotional dependency. Machiavelli's most profound insight was that power preserved today becomes exponentially more powerful tomorrow. The man who chooses strategic solitude understands this mathematical reality. Every ounce of energy not spent on romantic drama compounds into greater strength over time. While others fragment their power across multiple relationships, obligations, and emotional dependencies, he concentrates his force into a single, focused beam that can cut through any obstacle. This isn't mere preservation, it's strategic accumulation that creates unstoppable momentum. Power multiplies when it remains undiluted by competing priorities and external demands. The strategic man who avoids romantic entanglements doesn't just maintain his current level of influence. He experiences exponential growth because all his resources flow in the same direction. His decision-making remains sharp because it's not clouded by emotional considerations. His goals remain clear because they're not compromised by someone else's agenda. His time remains his own because it's not divided between personal ambitions and relationship maintenance. This concentrated power eventually reaches a tipping point, where opportunities seek him out rather than him chasing opportunities. Women become attracted to his obvious strength and independence rather than him pursuing their validation. Business partnerships emerge because others recognize his reliability and focus. His reputation for being uncompromising becomes an asset that opens doors previously closed to men who seemed easily influenced or distracted. The ultimate Machiavellian truth reveals itself. The prince who refuses to share his throne ends up ruling a kingdom larger than any he could have governed with a partner. The path Machiavelli outlined for princes remains as relevant today as it was 5 centuries ago. True power demands sacrifice, and the greatest sacrifice is often the comfort of companionship for the strength of sovereignty. The modern man who chooses strategic solitude over romantic entanglement isn't avoiding life. He's choosing the more difficult path that leads to genuine freedom and uncompromised power. This journey requires confronting loneliness, resisting social pressure, and maintaining discipline when every instinct screams for connection and validation. But those who endure this trial emerge as the architects of their own destiny rather than passengers in someone else's vehicle. The question that haunts every man who hears this truth is simple yet profound. Are you willing to walk alone today so you can stand unshakable tomorrow? Or will you continue trading pieces of your power for temporary comfort until nothing remains of the kingdom you were meant to rule? If this message resonates with a part of you that refuses to compromise your potential for anyone or anything, then subscribe to this channel because we're building an army of modern princes who understand that true strength comes from within.